I want to throw another MVP candidate in the mix, and it's going to transition us into our next topic. Maybe a team I cover a little bit. The New York Mets. Do you know that since April 10th, now 60-game sample size, Francisco Lindor is leading the National League in wins above replacement at 2.9. He's been unbelievable. I don't think that he's necessarily going to win the MVP, but I'll tell you what, he has been the most valuable player to the Mets, by a landslide. If you go back to this stretch, and I just did an article about the Mets for us at Just Baseball, and it was based on my podcast today with Locked On Mets. And the lead into the conversation is Grimace, how everyone's talking about Grimace. And I want to focus on what's happening on the field and how this 6-game winning streak that has coincided with Grimace throwing out the first pitch at a Mets game, the winning stretches back the last 3 weeks. And what happened was Jorge Lopez launched his glove into the stands. We talked about it on this show, how the Mets were a disaster at the time. And Francisco Lindor, after that incident, locks the door to the clubhouse, holds a player-only meeting about accountability. And JD Martinez has since said, as a guy who's been around this league a long time, it's the best players-only meeting he's ever been a part of. And the message of the meeting was pretty simple. Hold yourself accountable. If you can look at yourself in the mirror and you can really feel good about your process and you've done everything you can to be the best player you can be, well, then that's all that matters. It's been about having more fun and taking some of the pressure off. Everybody thinks the Mets are the worst team. Well, let's just go out and play and not worry about it. Coming off of that meeting, do you know what Francisco Lindor did in that first game?
17 home runs.
Yes. No. So close. First game off of it, he gets a leadoff hit. He's been batting leadoff for a while now. He steals second base, gets stranded. Third inning, he hits a solo home run. Seventh inning, his last at bat of a 4-for-4 day, he ties the game in a 2-1 game. And then JD Martinez ends up hitting a home run that proves to be the difference. We have since seen Lindor and Martinez really spark this run for the Mets. And, between holding the players only meeting, standing in front of the New York media for 11 minutes after that meeting, and just being accountable to his club, and then his play ever since, I got to tell you, it's been really impressive to watch Francisco Lindor. And I think as we even get into our all-star conversation in a minute here, he's pretty deserving of some acclaim this season with what he's done to really shake off what was a horrible start.
The thought of Francisco Lindor as a National League MVP candidate did, in fact, make me grimace, right? I winced a bit and thought, I think I don't know that he's a problem, but there's been a lot of issues with him in that Mets clubhouse. And so knowing that he's the one who held the closed door meeting or was at the front of it, and JD Martinez saying it was one of the best closed door meetings, team only, players only meeting that he's ever witnessed, and talking about accountability. I wonder if Francisco Lindor stood up and said, like, look, I've not done a great job in a lot of different ways, and was just brutally honest. I don't know. That would be pure speculation, but it feels like when there are issues with the Mets, there are issues with Francisco Lindor. And if they're playing really well, it's got to be something to do with, Francisco Lindor being at the forefront of that and being open and honest and taking accountability and standing in front of the media and saying that after maybe some issues that he had, of course, fighting with Jeff McNeil, and both those guys I'm sure are equally accountable in that, just standing up there and taking strike three, and just other little things that maybe seem a little lackadaisical, for him to maybe get that message and understand the assignment that he is a valuable player. We saw it in Cleveland. We've seen him do it at times for the Mets, that if he can really lead by example, then other guys can follow and pick up the slack on that. And it's absolutely worked for the Mets. And so it wouldn't surprise me that Lindor really held his own feet to the fire in that way, because it seems like, he could be, again, the gift and the curse in that clubhouse a little bit, because the Mets are tied to him, right? He's going to be around. Pete Alonso, we don't know about, but Francisco Lindor, we do. And so maybe this is a change in attitude and mindset and the way he goes about his business. And if that's true, then the Mets are definitely going to benefit from it.
I think from watching every game of this 4-year tenure with Lindor and the Mets, I think there has been some narratives that have formed from the 2021 season where he started off bad, and there was the booing situation where He didn't know how to handle it, and then he did the thumbs down celebration with Javi Baez, and that created a firestorm. There was the fight with McNeil, though I think the fight itself was more about McNeil and not paying attention to defensive positioning. But after the whole making up a story to the New York media, Lindor has come a really long way from where he was in year 1 in New York to year 4, and it's a big change. You go from playing in Cleveland, where you were just the beloved son of the city, right? You came up as a 21-year-old. Year 2, you lead the team to the World Series, and he said it recently. He said in Cleveland, it would be like he would go like 0 for 50 before he'd hear it. In New York, if he goes 0 for 8, he starts to hear it, and that's the adjustment that you have to make. And he had to make that adjustment also on the heels of signing a $341 million contract before he played a game. So as someone who's watched the whole thing, I think he's got a really bad rap for things that he can't really control. He's been a 6-win player the last 2 years, and he's now on pace again to be probably a 6-win player. It's a 60-game sample where he's put up basically 3 wins. I mean, if you extrapolate that over a full season, he's been even better than that. This is a guy that has really embraced leadership this year in a way I hadn't quite seen in the past. In the offseason, he had personal moments where he took Mark Vientos and Brett Beatty aside for like extended weekends and helped them with their defense. And here are 2 guys that have showed up this year, young players, who have been dramatically better defensively. So seeing things like that, seeing the way he's handled the media through his struggles, helping the Mets into this point, I cannot be more of a advocate for this guy as someone who covers him and can see what he's done. And yeah, he probably isn't going to win the MVP, but damn it, if he's not a really good player that's worth that contract that gets way too much slander, particularly from his own fan base that still doesn't embrace him despite how good he's been.
And he's getting slander from your co-host. So you're right. He's getting it everywhere. And some guys, right, it can take that amount of time to mature into the player that the franchise thinks they're going to be. And even with all of those struggles that he's had and those adjustments to being this superstar player or a player who's had the superstar tag placed upon him, certainly because of that large contract, there are other guys that just can't do it at all for 1 minute. So he's still been able to post, and he's one of those players where at the end of every year you look at the numbers and they're really strong. And I know wins above replacement kind of, I'm not gonna say favors him, but he's one of those players where you look at his numbers and sometimes I think maybe it's because it's more batting average. You go, wow, all right, that's a little bit more valuable than I would have guessed. So he's doing enough of those things right, obviously. So it's nice for the Mets fan base to have him there as a leader. And look, we've talked about it a lot, how these narratives get started in media and in the sports world, and something either for a good or bad reason, right? It gets attention. But in New York, on the East Coast, with a team that is really struggling to find their identity and having these overpriced players, but at the same time, some of those overpriced players are on other teams. And is Steve Cohen gonna figure some things out? Well, it turns out he had the pieces before he even bought the franchise. They were already there. The best guy for the job and for the task of winning a World Series was already on the roster, and it was Francisco Lindor. So I think very quickly these things can kind of begin to change. And I've seen it many times, Ryan. You put something out there into the ether, and then all of a sudden, whether it's because someone specifically heard you say it or not, it builds this momentum. And all of a sudden, hey, why isn't Francisco Lindor getting enough MVP conversation? Why isn't he getting enough attention for that? And I think we're going to start to see that happening because of this win streak.
Yeah, if they can maintain this and if he can keep this play going, I mean, it's crazy because, again, I tell you, the last 60 games, he has been the most valuable player in the National League, and he's only played 71 games this season. So 11 games at the beginning has been a hole that he has tried to dig himself out of all year, and that's what happens when you start 1 for 31. But he's done that, and we'll see how much he can continue to climb out of that hole. But he has added, since he's switched to the leadoff spot, he has added 115 points on his OPS in a single month. So that tells you how hot he's been, how hot the Mets have been. And we will continue to monitor the NL wildcard race because it's so many teams that are right there. I mean, it's 9 teams separated by 4 games right now, 8 teams separated by 2 games. So it's something that is not going away. That's going to be the conversation that we're going to have all throughout the next month and a half as teams have to decide if they are in or out on this season for the deadline.
It feels like this race that we're talking about for the 3 wild card spots isn't a race of the tortoise versus the hare. It's tortoise versus tortoise because no one's breaking away from the pack, and it's really just hold on, survive, try to stay as close to 500 as possible, and not go off on a sprint like the hare. It's tortoise versus tortoise in the National League right now.
I mean, the Cardinals have shot up just by virtue of not falling under. Where like the Padres were sitting comfortably in that second wild card spot. The Mets sweep them, and I think they've got off to a rough start. I don't know if they're playing the Phillies now. I think Phillies or Braves. I'm not sure which, but regardless, they've won. I think they've lost like four or 5 in a row. Now they're sitting in this position where they've fallen from second to they're out of the picture. It is pretty crazy. Just play 500. Get yourself over and play 500 for the rest of the year. If you get to 4 games over and you play 500 baseball, you're probably going to be in the playoffs in the National League with how weak the rest of this league is.
Yeah, very true. It's interesting. The trade deadline, I think, is going to end up shifting and all. And I think it's just one of the positive things about having the wild card. And I think folks might have been worried when there were 3 that, well, everyone's going to be in it, so then no one's going to be trading. And we haven't really had that problem. It's just kind of kept more teams relevant. Whereas in seasons past with 1 wild card or even 2, it just feels like there would be no shot whatsoever. This wouldn't have been one of those seasons with 2 wild cards because it's really Atlanta as the top wild card team, and they're legit, right? They're 8 games over 500, but then the second wild card is only 1 game over, so anybody can have that. With 3, now all teams are really in the conversation, and I think that keeps it fun and it keeps those teams and the fan bases relevant and invested, deeper into the summer.
If there was ever a year where the 3rd wild card would get in with like 79 wins, kind of like your 7-9 football team or whatever from the past, it would be this season. But I think ultimately there's going to be a couple teams that post deadline figure some things out, and we're going to look at it by the end of the season. I think it's going to be, the wild cards are probably all going to have 85, 86 wins or more because there's going to be enough that put it all together. But at this juncture, it's hard to figure out who that team is going to be.